Graham Oppy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. So I thought the first topic that we would look into is, broadly speaking, the relationship between science and religion, or I guess more specifically between science and theistic belief. Because one of the subject areas of my research is the fine-tuning argument, both for theism and for a multiverse in scientific discussion. And on the surface anyway, the fact that our universe apparently began to exist with the Big Bang and that it appears to be fine-tuned for the existence of life are both two instances of evidential significance for theism. They seem to indicate, at least to some extent, that there is a designer and creator. That's a rough and ready statement of the relevant theistic arguments. But what do you think? What do you think is, what's your take on the relationship between current science and theistic belief?
Okay, so maybe we should talk in particular about the fine-tuning, given that you've brought that up. And there's a couple of interesting philosophical questions about whether the fine-tuning cuts any ice between, say, naturalism and theism. And so I have an argument that it doesn't, which I can give you in a minute. But before that, I want to pick up on one thing that you said. If the universe is fine-tuned, it's not clear at all what it's fine-tuned for. So if you think about the typical accounts of the fine-tuning, what people say is, had things been just a little bit different with respect to the constants that are fine-tuned, either the universe would have lasted for a tiny fraction of a second, it would have barely begun to expand before it collapsed back in on itself, or it would have blown apart so rapidly that it would have never contained anything really but occasional blips of radiation. Right. Now, that doesn't just rule out life. It rules out, for example, stars. If you had a deity that really liked stars, then this would not be evidence for a traditional deity at all, right? If it turned out that what the universe is fine-tuned for, what the creator really wanted is just something that had lots of bright, sparkly things in it. So you have to be a bit careful in saying that the universe is fine-tuned for life, right? Even if you grant that it's fine-tuned, right? That the data is solid, the universe would have been very different if the values of those basic parameters had been slightly different.
Okay, I'm willing to grant you that.
Okay.
But what do you... Do you take that to have a further implication, or is that just a clarificatory?
That's just a sort of clarificatory point, that's all.
Sure.
So now let me put that point aside and let's consider what you might say about the values of the constants and why they take the values that they do. And I'm going to think about what a naturalist or a theist might say about this, right? So it seems to me that we should distinguish two cases. One possibility is that the values of the constants have always been fixed to their actual values. It's always been determined what the values of the constants are. So there was no point in the history of the universe or in the history of causal reality more broadly, where there was a transition from them being not fixed to their being fixed. Right? So we have two options, right? Always been fixed, or there was a point at which there was a transition from being not fixed to fixed. If there's a transition from not being fixed to fixed, then it looks as though the values take the values that they do as the result of some indeterministic process, because that's kind of what the not being fixed and transitioning to fixed means. So it's essentially on that side of the story, it just turns out to be a matter of chance. And then it doesn't matter how improbable the values are. If you're a theist or a naturalist and you think that there, at some point there's a transition from not fixed to fixed, then you think that there's something indeterministic going on. There might still be a difference between the theist and the naturalist. I'll come back to that. But I want to consider the other option first. The other option is that they've always been fixed. Right? So thinking of either we assume there's a kind of infinite regress and the fixedness just keeps getting passed forwards, in which case we're done. We don't need any further explanation, but nobody really likes infinite regress, so let's just drop that. The other possibility is that there's an origin, and now there are two options. Either the origin is necessary or it's contingent. If it's contingent, then it's just a kind of unexplained contingency that the things in the initial state have the values that they do, so it's an unexplained contingency what the values are. Right? That nobody really likes that either. That's not very satisfying. So let's go to the other option, which is that it's necessary. Right? The values are as they are because they had to be. Now you might think that sounds weird, right? But it's ultimately what we're driven to when we consider all of the other unattractive options. So we've got two things that are left: necessary or fixed by some indeterministic mechanism. Now let's consider what these options look like for theists and for naturalists. So if you're a theist and you think it's fixed from the beginning, then what you're supposing is that God, just by nature from the beginning, was determined to set the values to these particular values and couldn't do otherwise. Right? That's what the making them necessary amounts to. That's not the way that theists usually go, and I'll come back to that in a minute. For the naturalists, what you're going to say is, okay, so it's just baked into the initial state of causal reality, whatever that state is, that the values are as they are. Okay. And it doesn't look like there's any relevant difference in explanatory power between theism and naturalism if that's the way we go, if we say that it's necessary, right? They both have the same explanation. You mightn't think that it feels very satisfactory on either case because it's hard to see how it could be necessary, but regardless of that, we could go that way. The other way we could go, I said, was to make it the outcome of an indeterministic process. Right? So for the naturalist, the plausible view is in the initial state of the universe, the values aren't fixed. At some point, there's a kind of phase transition or something like that. And the values go from not fixed to fixed. And it doesn't matter what the probability is. If there was such a transition, it's sort of like it doesn't matter whether a lottery has 1 billion tickets or 1 zillion tickets, right? All that changes, nothing changes if it's a lottery where there's only going to be one winner. You don't feel pressure as the lottery gets bigger and bigger to start questioning whatever the story is about how the tickets, the winning tickets selected or anything like that. Theist version. Okay, so here's the theist version. God initially is deliberating about which universe to make. And there's a range of possible universes that God can make. And then God just happens to pick one because for any possible universe, God can make it. And there's nothing in the circumstances, since there's only God, that determines that God goes one way rather than another. So basically we've got a kind of chance outcome over a vast range of outcomes, as many universes as God can make. Now here comes the question. Are there more possible universes, more possible ways that things can come out if you have a kind of phase transition in the natural universe, or if you have God picking from all the possible universes that God can make? I'm happy to declare that a draw. and say that there's no reason to favour either the naturalist or the theist at this point. But you might want to play on. If you do want to play on, it looks as though what you're going to say is, well, obviously all those universes, the naturally possible universes, God can make them. But there's probably others that God can make as well. Presumably there could be universes that are not fine-tuned, and God could make some of those. So it looks like God's got an even bigger range of choices. If we assume sort of equal likelihoods, then theism's going to be worse. If we don't assume equal likelihoods, and I didn't assume that in either case, then it's hard to know, right? What sort of thing is going to change the probabilities here so that, say on the one hand, for the naturalist, even though there's quite a big range, there was some physical thing that pushed it towards the fine-tuning range, or for God, there were some kinds of considerations that meant that even though there are other worlds where God's no different from this one, where God chooses that other thing, there were pressures that made it more likely that God would choose the fine-tuning, right? All up, it strikes me that this is just a wash, right? There's no advantage to either side here once you think about it like this. And I realise this is not the standard way that people think about fine-tuning argument, but it's the way that I think about it.
I should have taken a note from your playbook and brought paper and a pencil to write down my thoughts, because this is complicated material, but it's very interesting. Let me start at the big picture and raise a potential objection to this entire way of responding to a theistic argument, in that it seems like it would undermine any possible line of evidence for theism whatsoever, however extravagant or extreme, and therefore it might reduce to absurdity. I mean, for any line, possible observation, even what has been called super awesome theistic evidence, or I guess that's what I call it. It's just called awesome theistic evidence of looking into the sky and seeing the Nicene Creed written out in the stars. You could apply the same kind of analysis and say, well, the origin of this phenomenon is either necessary or contingent, and in either case, it doesn't look like theism has an advantage over naturalism. But surely something has gone wrong in the awesome theistic evidence case. Clearly, if the stars realigned to spell out the Nicene Creed, the traditional creedal statement of Christian belief, that is, we would have some evidence for theism over against naturalism. That doesn't tell us where your line of reasoning goes wrong, but it suggests that something has gone amiss if you can just dismiss any possible evidence for theism along these lines. What do you make of that?
So I wasn't thinking that any sort of evidence could be dismissed in this way. So in particular, if you had really good evidence for miracles, by which I mean direct, special divine action, right? It won't turn out that in those kinds of cases that there's a kind of plausible naturalistic explanation of what's happened that appeals to necessity, because at least I think on plausible versions of naturalism, there's lots of indeterminism. It's not like the initial state determines everything that comes afterwards. So you're not, you won't be able to sheet it home in any plausible way to the initial conditions. And then you face the problem of coming up with a naturalistic explanation of why it is that the stars spell out the Nicene Creed, and that's not going to look very plausible either. And so it seems as though in that case, were it to happen, you'd get a clear advantage for theism.
Well, but my worry is that the same objections you raised to the theistic explanation of fine-tuning would implicate any theistic implications of any possible evidence for theism, like the stars aligning to spell out the Nicene Creed. You would say, well, given God's omnipotence, the range of possibilities open to him is probably infinite beyond comprehension. And so if we just ascribe each possible action God could have taken equal likelihood, then the likelihood of these observations given theism is incredibly small. So it does seem to me that there's some kind of parity.
So it seems to me that it breaks down, though, because it made sense to think about the fine-tuning, to ask the question, because it's sort of global parameters that govern the whole of the universe. Where do they get fixed? Right, because that matters. Where do they get fixed? And then what's your story about how they get fixed? In the case of the stars spelling out, I don't think that it's at all plausible that we're going to think, okay, so that's fixed from the beginning, right? At least on the naturalist side of the story, we're not going to suppose that that's fixed from the beginning. And so you're left looking for a story of a particular kind. It's not. So it seems to me that it's quite different from the case where it's genuinely open, right? It's an open question, both, I think, from the point of view of the physics and from the point of view of theism, where the fine-tuning, the values of the constants get fixed. And so that makes it possible to run the kind of argument that I was giving, where it's not simply not possible to run it in the kind of case that you're imagining. Right? It just can't get going in the first place, this kind of argument. It seems to me.
Well, that's something I'll have to reflect on. But so that would be the first where I'd want to register, is that it seems guilty of overkill, that you could easily dismiss what might otherwise be reasonable theistic inferences based on this kind of general analysis that either the explanation is necessary or contingent. If it's necessary, it will be equally as plausible or implausible as a naturalistic necessity. But if it's contingent, it will be equally as indeterministic or unlikely given theism or naturalism.
Okay, but then that wasn't how I argued. What I argued was it's got to be some point where it gets fixed or not. And then I considered a range of possibilities, not just necessary and contingent, but there could be an infinite regress. There could be, it could be brute contingency at an origin. It could be necessity at an origin. It can be, although I didn't talk about this, it can be a kind of mix of necessary and contingent features at the origin. And then when we go to transition, it's got to be at that point indeterminism, right? So there's all of there's a bunch of things here, and that style of analysis, with all of taking all of those things into account, only applies to things where, in cases where what we're deciding between is saying that something's so because it's always been so, saying that it's so because there was a beginning point and it was so at the beginning point, whether necessarily or contingent, or it was so at it became so at some later point as a result of the outplaying of indeterminism. Right now, there's lots of ordinary explanatory contexts where nothing like that applies. Like you decide to go to the fridge and get yourself a beer, and there's no I can't in coming up with an explanation for why you do that. This framework that I've been talking about is completely irrelevant, right? And if we suppose that the choices here that you did it because you wanted to or because God told you to, it's still not going to, it's still not going to be that there's some argument of the kind that I was running that's going to get a grip at this point.
I'll have to think about that, because you might be right about that, but this is a new kind of argument I haven't considered. There was a second issue, though, that came to mind that is worth exploring, and that's in what I took to be the implicit assumption that we should apply a uniform probability distribution over God's possible actions in terms of, I take it, what kind of universe to create. And the idea that I got was that if theism is true, there's actually a wider range of possible universes or outcomes than if naturalism is true, because God can create all sorts of kinds of realities that are inconsistent with naturalism. So why should we apply a kind of blanket equal probability to all these possibilities? Because in addition to being omnipotent, you're quite right that if all we're taking into account is omnipotence, I think it's correct that we could have absolutely no idea what kind of reality such a being would create. If we did apply kind of this uniform probability, any particular universe would be vanishingly unlikely. There's no way to get a grip on the likelihoods. But God is also taken to be perfectly good. And so many theists, in the context of fine-tuning, will argue that God's moral perfection served to privilege those outcomes that result in a universe that brings about moral value. And that seems relatively plausible. And so then the claim will be, if a morally perfect omnipotent God exists, then we can, with some justification, say that a universe fine-tuned for conscious life is non-negligibly likely, because such a universe allows the moral good of conscious agents. And so we shouldn't apply a blanket or uniform probability distribution. Rather, we should say that all things are not equal. Rather, those outcomes that are good have a higher likelihood than others. I think that's probably what fine-tuning advocates would say in this particular context. What do you take of that?
So I guess what I think about that is that it's not clear that what's going on in the worlds, the possible worlds, where God's just as God is in this world, because in the beginning there's just God, and how God is doesn't vary across the worlds, I assume. What's going on in the worlds where God makes one of the other universes, because we agree that it was possible for God to make them, and if it's possible for God to make them, there's some possible world where God does, right? It's not like there's some interfering factor. It's just that God chooses to make the world, which lasts for a tiny fraction of a second, or the non-fine-tuned world, which is because, as I said and as you added, right, it's not obvious why God's being omnipotent is limited to worlds that are fine-tuned like ours. So it's not clear to me that you can put together the non-flat distribution with the fact that you've got this perfect being making these things, right? If God really was disposed to make a world like ours, how could it turn out that God made any other sort of world? And yet we started off with the assumption that it was possible for God to make all of these worlds, right? So that's I mean, there are problems with talking about flat distribution here. We would have, I mean, there are kind of independent problems in the theory of probability, but it's really not clear how to me anyway, it wasn't clear to me how to think about this.
But don't you think that the problem you're raising is just nothing more than, or I suppose nothing other than the general problem of understanding libertarian accounts of free will? I mean, all of them are going to posit this kind of irreducible type of choice that, while somehow grounded in or guided by reasons, is not caused by them, such that there is still genuine choice or indeterminacy involved, and yet it's not a random occurrence. It seems to me that your issue with the theistic explanation is just no different than kind of these general issues with libertarian accounts of free will. Is that right?
Well, I'm not sure that's right. I'm not sure how you should think about, I mean, I'm not going to tell you how you should be thinking about God, but it seems that there's something not quite right with a God that preferences certain kinds of actions and then does something else, right? That just seems to be a departure from perfection in a certain kind of way. So,
well, I think because the preferences are, you'd have to say, I'm thinking off the top of my head, the preferences are underdeterminative, so that God's moral perfection does prohibit him from pursuing irredeemably evil ends. That's quite right. But that preferences for moral ends does not delimit the range down to one particular good end, but leaves open several possible good things God could have done. And then it was simply God's prerogative to choose what kind of good reality to make. I don't see the obvious problem with that over and above general issues with understanding libertarian freedom in general.
So God could have made our world, and instead God didn't. God made a world that lasted for a tiny fraction of a second, just collapsed in on itself immediately. Really, there's, even though there's so many reasons why God might prefer our world to that one, and yet, being just as God is, God makes that world, right? I don't know. I find that hard to believe. Right?
Well, maybe you're right.
Even hard to make sense of.
Well, maybe you're right, because I grant that there are certain courses of action which are in and of themselves coherent, but that a perfectly good being and just a perfect being wouldn't pursue. But that doesn't mean that all such options are fixed. So I think that you're probably right that a universe that lasts for a second, it seems irrational to make it. I mean, maybe there is something different from the divine vantage point that shows there's great good to be realized. But the problem, it occurs to me, relates to the problem of no best world facing theism, or a version of it, that if there is a best possible world, a perfect being would create that world. That seems reasonable enough. I think that is kind of the intuition driving your argument, that if there's a perfect world, a perfect being would create it. Why would they do anything else? But if there is no perfect world, if there's just an ever-increasing chain of better and better worlds, what do you think a perfect being would do?
Okay, so there's a literature on this, and I've read some of it, so I'm going to give you Klaus Kray's answer. God actually makes all the worlds that are good enough, right? That still won't get in the world that blows apart, right? So
yeah. So that is the answer you think? I mean, so you think theism does predict this expansive theistic multiverse?
No, I'm just giving that to you. I'm just giving that to
Sure.
you as one way of answering this question. It's a short way of saying even amongst theists, there are different ways of answering this question. Right.
Well, I agree with you, but I meant that if we think that God can make a choice among different options in the context of no best world, then that'll be all we need to say that God can make a choice of which universe to create when multiple options are left open once you've taken account of moral considerations.
Right, but this is this taking account of moral considerations, right? The choice between the instant bang versus a world like ours, because it's not clear what moral considerations there are other than negative ones. God can't make an irredeemably evil, awful world, right? It's got to rise to a certain threshold. That's sort of Klaus Kray's view, right? So all the worlds that are good enough, and let's not worry exactly how we determine what good enough means here, but that's how it goes, right? It's not clear that there's kind of moral prohibition on making the world that just lasts for a tiny fraction of a second, right? And yet, it still seems, to me anyway, that that most theists are going to think, really, it just couldn't have been that God made that world in preference to the one that we live in.
So what about a situation or state of affairs of God existing alone, delegating not to create any created order, versus creating our world? Those strike me as two options open to God, in contrast to this kind of irrational and pointless exercise in universe creation where it lasts for a second. A world, a possible world where God alone exists versus one with us and this universe, this created order. Those two strike me as options genuinely and robustly open to God, And so then the question will be, well, why did God create this world? Well, you can still cite the reasons of the moral value of conscious life and wanting to create creatures who can be in relationship to him, but those reasons won't be necessitating reasons. And some philosophers will object to that and say, well, we need an even deeper explanation. But I suspect that if you grant libertarian freedom, you're just not going to get one for any action, a free action taken. And I don't know, is that not good enough?
Okay, so yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, I think that theists kind of divide on whether God has to create or not issues. So if you're if you're a Molinist and you think that God has this kind of pre-volitional insight, that the cards could just go against God, and the right thing for God to do is to choose not to create, right? So there's that way of going. But if you don't like Molinism and you're thinking about God, you might think that it just can't be in God's nature not to create, right? I can imagine. I don't know if Brian Leftow would say this, but maybe he would. I can imagine, various theistic philosophers hewing that line.
Right, I think you're right. So there's a diversity of opinion. I evidently am much more in the camp that sees these creative options as genuinely open, that there's nothing within God's nature that necessitates that he creates. And so let's explore that a bit more. Some philosophers disagree with me. Philosophers disagree on literally everything. So let's say that God has to create necessarily. And let's even say that he has to create a fine-tuned universe necessarily.
Or let's go further.
Go ahead.
Say he has to create this world, be Spinoza, or arguably Leibniz, right?
Sure. It'll create bigger issues with modal collapse, but maybe we can still have a fruitful exploration of it. So it's still not clear to me that the theist doesn't have an explanatory advantage for fine-tuning if we say that God necessarily fine-tuned the universe. Because there's still a deeper explanation for why the fundamental features of physics have the values that they do. Namely, say, God's nature compels him to create a universe with life, and other facts about God fix the various other aspects of the world, which together entail that our universe is fine-tuned for life. So on that picture, there is a deeper explanation for why the features of physics take the values that they do, even if they do so necessarily. Whereas on the naturalistic picture, brute necessity isn't really a category most people recognize, but you don't have a deeper explanation on this account.
So let's try something else now. I don't think that there's a distinction between kinds of necessities, right? If something's necessary, it's so no matter what, there's no explaining why it's necessary, right? So when you said there's a deeper explanation, there might be explanations for other things, but just on the point of its being necessary, there's nothing further to say, according to me. Right? Because when you do, you're, first of all, on the one hand, you said no matter what, and now you're giving me a what, right? You're undermining the very position that you were adopting.
Well, but wouldn't you say that on this theistic account, the features of physics take the value they do because God fixes them that way, necessarily? So there are two levels of explanation, despite the fact that both steps are necessary, both obtained in all possible worlds or something.
So I guess I don't see it that way. I think that if that you can have relations of entailment between necessities, because we obviously do. But then we trace back till we get to the kind of necessities between which there are no entailments. And that's where we ask the question, right? So in the particular case where we're imagining that God fixes the values, right? given that an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good being says that the values shall be such and such, the values are such and such. If it's necessary that the being says that the values are such and such, then it's necessary that the values are such and such. But the kind of theoretical commitment that you get there is kind of negative because it isn't. I mean, sorry, there isn't a kind of theoretical commitment there because you just go back to the necessary thing from which that kind of from which it follows that this thing is necessary was it's being necessary that God assigned the values in the way that God did.
Right. Say more on what you mean by negative theoretical value. Well, I didn't quite catch
that.
So,
okay, so I'm thinking now about what your kind of total theory looks like, and we're going to count up how many times you postulated necessity, right? So how many brute necessities were in your theory, right? The only one that the theist got is the theist says, so fundamental posit, God, it's necessary that God says the values of the constants are such and such, right? And then we have an entailment from that to it's necessary that the values are such and such. But that's not a kind of primitive feature of the theory. It's just something that's entailed by the fundamental posit about God. Right. It's not like you have two costs here. There's just one theoretical cost and an entailment. In your theory, the way that I think about it, your costs come basically from the axioms, and everything that's entailed by the axioms, everything that's a consequence of the axioms you get for free. So when we're comparing the theories, we want to know which one's more expensive. We'd be double counting if we counted both the necessity of the constants and the necessity of God's making the constants have those values.
Okay, I think I'm understanding what you're saying, that both theism and naturalism in this case have one fundamental axiom of necessity. It's just that theism locates it one step further behind the constants rather than...
Yes.
Okay, so then then the question will be, does that still represent a genuine explanatory advance? It's not obvious to me that it doesn't, but...
It's certainly not obvious that it does, because it's the same kind of thing. You're saying a certain thing is necessary, right? And so the kind of postulating an explainer, right, that's of the same kind as the thing to be explained, typically isn't an explanatory advance. So here's my favourite example, right? Question: what holds up the Earth? Answer: an elephant, right? The Earth rests on an elephant. Problem solved. Well, no. Problem not solved at all, because there's in that case, because what holds up the elephant? It's true that, I mean, leaving other things aside, that on your theory, unlike on mine, there's a reason why the Earth doesn't fall, namely that there's something that's holding it up. But having something else that's a kind of unexplained, that you don't explain why it falls, makes your theory worse, not better, right? Even though you could answer a question that I couldn't answer, right? Your theory was worse because there was a similar question that you couldn't answer, and you postulated an extra thing and hadn't really got rid of the question that was being asked. So it really does kind of matter. If I've got I say necessity at this point, and you go, no, necessity, but at an earlier point that explains that point, it feels to me that you're making a move very similar to the Earth and elephant, right? There's got to be some other advantage that you're getting. Now, of course, there might be, because it might be that your postulation of God is providing you with an answer to lots of questions, right, are unifying lots of stuff. But if we're just zooming in and thinking about this particular point, just thinking about the fine tuning, right, you're worse off because you've got an extra thing, and and as far as I can see, there's no explanatory advance, right? It will only be if we view this in the context of a bigger picture that there's a chance that you'll be doing better.
You've got me there, but let me ask about a similar kind of argument that involves necessities, ultimately. You probably will just say the same thing, and I will ultimately be unable to reply. But take a typical framing of a moral argument for God's existence, where we encounter certain moral truths that torturing an innocent person for fun is wrong. These, on most people's common sense intuitions, this is an objective fact about reality. And not only is it objectively true, just like any other statement of history or science or mathematics, that torturing an innocent person for fun is wrong, it's also arguably necessarily true. It doesn't just so happen that in our world that this is the case. Rather, in all possible worlds, this moral fact obtains. So let's just grant that for the sake of argument. The theist will still advance a moral argument for God's existence. They'll still say that God provides the best explanation for these moral facts, even though they obtain necessarily. And the picture they'll paint is usually along the lines of divine command theory, that moral values, what we say is good and what we say is bad, are reflections of God's nature. And so the more that some state of affairs, some action reflects God's own nature, the better it is, the more morally valuable, and the less so, the worse it is. And then our moral duties, our obligations, right and wrong, stem from God's commands. Some of them being necessary commands, like the command not to torture innocent people for fun. That doesn't seem to be a contingent command. If God issued it, it would have to be necessary. And then they will claim that all other explanations are inferior or perhaps even just non-existent. Now, maybe they're wrong about that. But what would you say to that move once the necessity of these moral principles have been granted? Do you think that there's no longer any advantage to be gained from a theistic grounding or explanation of these principles?
Yeah, that's exactly what I think. So I'm inclined to think that the moral principles are necessary. I don't think that it's straightforward to work out what are the kind of basic necessary moral truths, but on the assumption that they're necessary, they hold in all possible worlds, and they don't need, I mean, given that they're necessary, fundamentally necessary, right? They're not, the ones that are, so I'm assuming that some moral truths are just entailed by others, and they just inherit necessity in a harmless way, but there's some fundamental ones that are just necessary. And for them, there's nothing that makes them true. There doesn't have to be, because they couldn't be otherwise. Right. So,
but do you grant that it's at least coherent, at least in a meta kind of way, because we're talking about counter possibles, but do you grant that it's at least coherent to say that such and such a state of affairs is good because it reflects God's nature? That does represent an explanation, and it seems to me it does in some sense, even if both God exists necessarily and that this moral truth obtains necessarily. Now, what you might say, though, is that there's still no explanatory advantage of the theistic hypothesis in explaining this fact, in giving us some reason to think that theism is true. So there's two kind of senses of explanation being used here. And even if we grant that in this dialectical context, there's no advantage for theism as an explanation because it posits the elephant holding the earth, the unexplained explainer. Still, from a philosophical vantage point, there still does seem to be an explanation for moral facts, even necessary ones, as reflections of God's nature. And so I guess just philosophically, independent of theism or atheism, I take issue with this idea that necessary facts can't admit of any deeper explanation.
So the ones that the kind of the ground level necessary facts. So I guess what I think about that is if there's, this won't be kind of orthodox, right? But if there's a perfectly good God, and if we could behave in ways that kind of reflected the attributes of God, we'd be doing good things, would be true. Arguably, it would be necessarily true. But it doesn't give you any insight into the status of the necessary truths about morality, which, and this is the bit that's not orthodox, I take it because they're necessary, just hold independently of God, right? So sure, if you have a kind of moral exemplar, you can, and you imitate them, you'll probably be doing good things, but that doesn't really give you any insight into the standing of the fundamental moral truths, according to me, right?
What do you mean when you say it doesn't give you any insight into it?
So it doesn't tell you about its metaphysical standing. Doesn't it certainly doesn't serve as an explainer for them, right? So I don't think that if you took this view that you would have to deny that God could be in some sense a moral exemplar, but you couldn't, I think, say that God somehow grounds or explains the moral truths if you think that the moral truths are these fundamental necessities.
This will be the last on this tangent, but it's interesting. I mean, what do you take of the Platonic account of moral values? That there are abstract entities like goodness itself, or beauty and love and kindness. These are abstract objects, usually taken to be timeless and spaceless, that exist necessarily. But that view, much like theism, posits a deeper metaphysical foundation for necessary truths, moral truths. And it doesn't seem to be unintelligible or unexplanatory, even though the relevant moral truths are necessary.
So there's a bunch of things to say here, and I'll probably forget some of them. One of them is that the opposing positions can be necessarily false, but not unintelligible. And in fact, you have to think that if you're at all interested in dispute between kind of necessary being theists and naturalists, right? Because each has to think that the other's gone wrong of necessity. But that doesn't stop us from, in some sense, comparing the views. So that's kind of the first point. I'm not going to say that necessarily that the Platonic story is unintelligible. I do think it's necessarily false. My preferred position is nominalism. I don't think there are any abstract objects of any kind. So, but it's not the easiest road to hoe, but I think it's the correct one. There was another thing I was going to say, which is that there's actually not that much distance between Plato and some brands of Christianity. So Thomists who talk about God as being kind of, there's this thing about simplicity, but they do often talk about God as being goodness itself, which they then identify with existence itself and so on. It's not a million miles away from Platonism, I think. I mean, again, that's a controversial view, I guess, but
that's fair. I guess the point I was getting at was that wholly apart from one's evaluation of the merits of Platonism, it seems at least somewhat clear that the inference that they are making is at least an explanatory one. And I mean, if we just commit to this idea that necessary truths don't admit of explanation, you can just deny that. But it seems to me, reflecting on the Platonic story, whatever else we might say about it, its grounding of moral truths in a Platonic realm seems explanatory, despite the necessity involved.
Right. So on their view, on that view, I guess it will be that what's fundamental isn't the truths. Right, what's fundamental is the forms, and the forms are not propositional. And then there's this thought that the forms are truth makers for various kinds of claims, but the forms couldn't have been otherwise, and the truth making couldn't have been otherwise. So the truths that are made couldn't have been otherwise. They're kind of entailments. They're derived. They're not fundamental. The truths themselves are not fundamental necessary truths. They're derived from other necessary truths, right? So I think that's fair that on the Platonic view you have a kind of explanation because you've got a kind of truth maker thing going on. But I don't think that's the right view, right?
Well, okay, I'm pleased that that's how you responded, because then it seems to me the theist will say, on their view, moral truths are not the fundamental truths. God is fundamental. He is the ultimate truth maker of moral truths, just like the Platonist thinks that moral truths are not fundamental, but Platonic entities are fundamental.
So I guess I think that you can say that. The competing view that that where we stop is with the truths is a kind of nominalist. You can think of it as like a kind of nominalism, right? We're going to get out truths without objects. You're going to get objectivity without objects, whereas the theist is going to tell a slightly different story from the Platonist, or maybe it's the same story in some cases, in which we've got a kind of object or a bunch of objects to make true the truths. That maybe the way to weigh this up isn't quite the way that I said it before. It does seem as though there's a kind of theoretical, that the considerations about simplicity go different on the two sides, right? Because we get a lessening in our sort of ontology on one way of going, but we get perhaps we get a kind of location of primitive necessity in a different place in our theories. Right, because in the theory that I favour, we just locate certain truths as being necessary, whereas in the other one, we have this ontology that we say is necessary, and then those truths turn out, the ones that turned out to be primitive on this side will turn out not to be on the other side. But there's another bunch of truths which are necessary on the other side. And now maybe it's slightly more complicated to compare the kind of theoretical merits of the two positions, right? Because it's not a straightforward trade-off.
All right, I think that's an interesting point, and it relates to the more general question I wanted to ask you, though I'm gathering what your basic response will probably be, and that's the general question of why should we be naturalists as opposed to theists? In your mind, what are the main advantages of a naturalistic worldview over a theistic one? And again, a lot of what we said prior, I think, will feature into your answer, but I'm curious if you had a direct way of saying that.
So the general idea is this. We compare the total theories, and we compare them for their theoretical virtues. So we imagine some finished, polished version of theism and some finished, polished, best version of naturalism. So, and then we imagine how are we going to choose between them. My answer is kind of Occamist or Bayesian or something like that, some combination of things like that. What we're looking to do is to pick the theory that does best at minimising its commitments and maximising explanation. So, and what we have to explain is, I'll say it in an uninformative way, all the relevant data, right?
All the stuff.
Yeah. So what I think is that naturalism turns out to have fewer commitments. Most people find that intuitive. Not everybody does. Some people try to argue against that, but I think that that's kind of plausible that naturalism has fewer commitments. And so the question is, are there explanatory advantages on the other side? I'm inclined to think that there aren't any, and so I think that naturalism wins, but I know lots of theists who think that there are plenty of explanatory advantages on the other side. They think that theism wins, and I think that it's kind of a matter for judgment here. It's not like there's some way of demonstrating that one side's right and the other side's wrong in any kind of independent way. That's the short version of the argument that I give in the best argument against God. I first of all say how I think the best argument goes, and then I say why I don't think that it's a successful argument. It's just the best of a bad lot.
I see what you're saying. So that even the best argument against God isn't successful, but that then raises the question: what constitutes a successful argument? Because after all, you are a naturalist. You're not an agnostic, right?
Yeah.
So something seems to warrant going past agnosticism to affirming naturalism. And if not a successful argument, what would it be?
So it's not an argument; it's a judgment about how things are, right? So if we're imagining it as a comparative judgment, I compare the two. Not that anyone ever really does this because it's too hard, but I compare the two theories and it seems to me when I weigh everything up bit by bit, and I go through everything, it seems to me that naturalism comes out ahead. I think that's how I would kind of reconstruct my reasons. And there are theists who've said exactly the same, like Richard Swinburne clearly has this view. He doesn't do as well at explicitly, saying there's a version of naturalism, here's a version of theism. He kind of just focuses on his version of theism and tries to do a kind of single case calculation of the probability. So in Bayesian terms, he just tries to calculate the posterior for theism, whereas I think you should go ratios and you should do a kind of ratio version of the posteriors for naturalism and theism, and then I think you can see that naturalism comes out slightly ahead if you adopt my views, but Swinburne would definitely see it the other way around. Right? So that's basically it.
Well, and that's reasonable enough, and then of course it would come down to the details, getting into specifics. But we've kind of done that. We've looked at fine tuning and the moral argument, which is, and I imagine that the considerations will be similar across different theistic arguments, with some variation. So
and across atheistic arguments as well, right? So there's this consideration about the distributions of goods and evils in the world, and I'm happy to. Unlike Paul Draper, I'm happy to call that one a tie when it comes to fitting theory to the data, so long as you're allowed to do things like in the theistic theory you put in that there are goods that we just couldn't possibly know about that God takes into account, which I can't see why you can't do that. Right, that's a net negative for the theory in terms of simplicity because you've postulated some more things that the naturalist doesn't believe in, but you can do that, right? It's your theory, you can do what you like with it, right? You do all of that stuff and then we come together and we try and compare the theories. It doesn't seem to me that there's any kind of killer consideration there that means that theism gets knocked out.
So I know you can't really ascribe precise numerical values to things like this. I mean, some people think you can, but I don't think that you can. What would your degree of confidence in naturalism be if you had to put something like a range of numbers to it?
Okay, so I don't think that you can do this calculation. So I prefer to couch all of this in terms of simplicity and explanation, right, without numbers. I think that the question about sort of how confident you are really is a separate question. It's not, even if you were a Bayesian and you could kind of do the numbers, there are two questions. One is what's the number you give, And then there's this, how robust is that number, right? And it's some combination of those two things together. Like I might be at 97%, but it's very fragile and I could easily be tipped down to 3% versus I'm at 50% and you just can't budge me no matter what. I'm kind of rusted on to 50%, right? So this is a Weasley way of avoiding giving you a number. And I'll say something else that for practical purposes, I'm just an out-and-out naturalist. It's not like I have doubts or worries, or I wake up some days and think, oh, maybe I should go to the mosque or the synagogue just in case, or something like that. That's not how I'm built.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. I won't press you on that. That's reasonable. I don't know how Bayesians analyze the robustness or rigidity of one's confidence in beliefs. I mean, I'm sure they've developed ways of trying to do that, but I don't know the literature well enough. I just find it purely on a personal level, I think is interesting to ask about how confident these key figures representing their worldviews are, because for me, I teeter just outside agnosticism almost all the time, and I wish I didn't.
So it's kind of interesting, like how confident am I in my analysis of, the arguments? Not particularly, right? That's just a different question from the, I mean, as I said, I don't think that the argument that I gave you is successful. I don't think argument's particularly useful. But once you start talking about theories and total evidence, it's very hard to get a grip, right, to make progress.
Mm. Yeah, it is, because you're dealing with so many moving parts at once when trying to assess the question, does God exist? It's enormously complex, and to come to a total judgment, you have to hold it all together. That's tough. That is tough to do. That's at least what I'm finding, even with just a single argument like the fine-tuning argument. It was the subject I picked for my master's dissertation. Kind of on a whim, because you have to pick something. But I'm glad that I did, because it's so much philosophy all at once. And so if you ask me, like you just said, what is your confidence in your particular analysis of this argument? Not very high. I could easily have gone wrong at several junctures. So, I mean, how do you avoid then an automatic agnosticism? If it really is just so much to try and take in at once, it almost seems that the human mind is incapable of doing it, and so we should just be agnostic. That is my constant battle.
Right. So you have friends in philosophy. Richard Feldman is one person who notoriously argued that philosophers should be agnostic about all philosophical claims. Right.
I feel that hard.
Right. But I think that it's fine to have opinions and just to stick to them, right? So this is one of the areas where this is that I think about quite a lot is the epistemology of disagreement, right? And so there's this dispute between the people who think that when you come up against a peer who disagrees with you, you should both shift towards the middle ground. And there are people who think, nah, you shouldn't do that. You should just stick, because in philosophy, it's common knowledge, right, that whatever opinions you've got, most philosophers disagree with you, no matter what you think, right? And so philosophy would become utterly boring if we all just moved to the agnosticism about anything. That would be the death of the discipline, right? It's perfectly fine to have these opinions, even though you can't really persuade other people to agree with you. I worry about this a lot, right? I worry about philosophy a lot, what kind of discipline it is, given that it has these features. But I'm not inclined to change my views about my philosophical opinions, right? I'm not inclined to do the Feldman thing and just collapse. It sounds like you're more inclined to do it than I am.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, maybe it can help me avoid that just by knowing other prominent philosophers who go, I don't. I go, okay, well, maybe. It's a complicated question. It's a metaphilosophical question, and a related question is the extent to which there's progress in philosophy. Now, I think that would be one maybe empirical argument for the Feldman conclusion, in that it's not obvious that philosophy over its multi-thousand-year history has made a whole lot of progress towards settled conclusions. Now, maybe it's made a different kind of progress, but it does lend itself to a perennial agnosticism to reflect soberingly on the past history of philosophy as one where we don't seem to be moving the battle lines much.
So I read the history quite differently from the way that you just read it, though. So if you go back far enough, there are very few areas where there's a kind of considered expert opinion, a body of stuff that people who are knowledgeable just agree on. Initially, it happened in mathematics. I mean, there was common sense stuff, like, is there a fox running across the path? Right, all competent adults can tell, right? So there's expert agreement on that kind of stuff. But beyond sort of common sense, the first area is maths. But later, there's this natural philosophy which goes on for millennium without making any progress, really. There's just all these people, but eventually, sometime in the kind of middle of the second millennium, roughly, we start to get a handle on methods for answering those questions, and consensus develops on answers to all kinds of questions that people in earlier times had just guessed at. And that process continues. So here's a nice example. In the 1820s, you can find philosophers saying, we'll never know what the stars are made from. We know they're a long way away and there's no way we can go there. We can never find out. Somewhat ironically, the decade before, the secret to how we were eventually going to answer that question had already come to light, but it still took, right? It's still another 100 years in the future before we get it settled. If you think about all the academic disciplines, they all once were philosophy, and psychology doesn't really get going till the middle of the 19th century. Sociology a bit later. Chemistry's a little bit after physics and so on, right? Really scientific biology. It's a bit kind of unclear exactly when we think it's really getting settled, and there's lots of agreement on the kind of interesting theoretical things and so on. So philosophy makes progress by turning into something else, and that happens a lot. And so that's my answer, right? Now, there are some things that we haven't made any progress on since Aristotle. Maybe we never will. Maybe metaphysics is just doomed to be something that we make no progress on. Maybe. But maybe not. Maybe one day, we'll sort things out, and there'll be some way in which kind of global, independent expert consensus is constructed. Don't know.
Philosophy makes progress by turning into something else. That's the nugget I'm going to take away from this. That's very interesting. So in the last few minutes, I thought it would be fun to just ask a few more personal questions about philosophy and you as a philosopher. Who would you say, because the run-up to this question is that William Lane Craig, who I'm sure you've heard of, was once asked who he thought was the most formidable atheist philosopher. And he said you, and that you are, quote, scary smart. Now, I would like to know from you, who do you think is the most formidable theistic philosopher writing today? If you had to pick, or a couple people, who would you say?
So if I had to pick some people, So I kind of feel reluctant to do this because I have lots of theist friends, and when it gets out that I've nominated some of them and not others, I'll be in trouble, right?
Well, I
So
will say you
it's
have the one advantage that I have a viewership of 32 subscribers right now. So for now, you're probably fine.
right. So amongst the people that I've met and I've talked to, I'll name some. So Alex Pruss, I think, is really good. Josh Rasmussen is really good. Bill Craig's not bad. I've had lunch with him a couple of times. I like his company and he's smart, right? So Richard Swinburne, likewise, I think very impressive. Um, I've never met Peter Van Inwagen, but I'm sure that he is super impressive too, just based on things that he's written. And there's a long list. I could go on. There are lots of people.
Sure, I appreciate that answer. I think that's a fair and diplomatic answer. So, in closing, something that is near and dear to my heart is the thinking about the future of philosophy of religion as a discipline. And I wonder, as a prominent philosopher of religion yourself, what do you think? Do you think anything about philosophy of religion as it's practiced today needs to change moving into the future? And I have in mind the specific allegation that's often made against philosophy of religion, that it seems to be very single-minded in its handling of religion, in that it focuses almost entirely on issues raised by Christian religion. As it's practiced, philosophy of religion tends to be philosophy of the Christian religion rather than philosophy of religion proper. Do you think this is a valid concern? And if so, what can we do to address that? And I mean that in a more personal way, because I want my area of research primarily to be philosophy of religion as I go into philosophy as a discipline. So it's helpful for me to hear.
So it may be true in the United States and the UK and Australia and New Zealand and parts of Europe that to date philosophy of religion is primarily focused on Christianity, but obviously that's not true in the rest of the world. Indian philosophy hasn't been primarily focused on Christianity, nor has Japanese philosophy, nor has Chinese philosophy of religion, and so on. Right. So one thing that I think will change is that we will speak more to people in other parts of the world. And that will inevitably lead to a change. The second thing is that it's already the case that there's been a significant presence of Jewish philosophers, and so, but maybe we think of Judeo-Christian, really meant to include them. There are more Islamic philosophers in the United States, in the UK and Australia and elsewhere than there were a decade ago as well, so there's some change there too. But again, you might just say, well, that's just the Abrahamic religions, right? My guess is, as I've already suggested, that this is changing and will change more quickly. Holding fixed any other questions you might have about what the future of the world's going to be like, because who knows really, but
Right. I agree with you. I have genuine uncertainty about even just very basic features of our life we take for granted and what that will look like even 30 years down the road. But we have to kind of just proceed and do our best into the future, day by day.
Yeah, so if there's so I said this in my other book, Atheism, the Basics, thinking about the future of atheism. I wasn't prepared to make a speculation more than 5 years ahead about whether the percentage of atheists, even in the so-called prosperous Western democracies, would go on growing in the way that it's been growing for the last 100 years. Who knows? It depends on so many questions that we don't know the answers to. What kind of economic and political circumstances we'll have 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now.
I think you're right. And so it is wise not to project more than 5 years. I agree with that. Well, thank you so much, Grant, for coming on the show. Was there anything else that you wanted to discuss? Were there any questions that you might have had?
No, I just wanted to say thank you for asking me onto the show and for asking me such good questions. I need to go away and think a little bit more about what I want to say in response to some of the questions that you asked, so that's a good thing.
Sure, I feel the same way. Very, very much appreciated. So, well, thank you so much, Grant, for coming on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great.